Thank you. So Mark's talk is a good lead to mine because, and particularly the last slide where he talks about unusual twins and twins who are not unusual and who are distinguished by growing up alongside another human being of the same age, and that's from conception. So a lot of the work that I do is focused on that majority, but keeping in mind that smaller group that have many difficulties. So the question is, are twins abnormal? Well, no, they're not, because statistically, as Mark presented in his talk, they're a low proportion of the population, so they're special. But are there differences in twin families beyond the fact that there are two children conceived and therefore from conception alongside each other? And my work as a developmental psychologist is focused on that. And I'm also interested not only in the problems, but the strengths of being a twin. And there are many of those too. And those of you in the audience who are parents, grandparents, or people who work with twins will know there's some enormous strengths as well. And I think it's important to highlight that too. So just as a starting point to ask about what is the risk associated with being a twin. And there are two types. One is the ones that are unique to being a twin. So twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome I have there is unique. You won't get that in a singleton population, nor will you get co-twin relationship as an issue. But there are some things that happen like small for gestational age, preterm birth, in singletons as well, but they happen more commonly in the circumstance of having in obstetrics a crowded womb, and in the social environment after children are born, having a crowded family with two children at the same time. So those are things about care burden and the disruption to interactions that happen. So a parent interacting with two children of the same age has a different sort of care burden, and there are some disruptions to normal patterns of interaction if normal is what we see in a single-born family. And that can also have impacts on families' mental health. So these are the issues that I'll bring up, but I think those distinctions between biological and social risk are important. By the way, the pictures that we have here are from some of the studies we've done where the twins do drawings to talk about their experiences of being at school or being a twin. So you'll see these coming all the way through. So how do these risks map out into the reality of being a twin and for their families as well? So I'm not going to talk too much about obstetrics because Mark has done that. But one of my themes here is the resilience of twin children. And so in the top slide, what we see is children who are single-born and looking at their gestation and then twins. And what you see is that twins actually have less, that they're more resilient. So if they're born at 23 weeks, they're going to do a lot better than a singleton born at 23 weeks gestation. So there's something in twins that make them more resilient. I asked Mark prior to this talk whether he knew what that was, and I think you said you didn't quite know, but this is a consistent finding. And we also see that there's slightly better resilience in firstborn twins than secondborn twins, which is a consistent finding too. So, but that first slide shows very starkly there's something biologically resistant in multiple birth children. And what the slide shows is that it's gestational. The other thing take home from the obstetric side of things is that it's gestation, that disability is associated with gestational age and small for gestational age. And I think that's a very strong message that comes out of what Mark has been talking about. So there's a little pattern of resilience there, but I'm going to go on to talk about the area of research that's my specialty, which is twin children's development, and do this as a myth or reality. So the first one I'm going to ask is, myth or reality, are twin children more likely to have developmental problems? Well, Mark has already shown that rates of death and disability are high when you have those extreme adverse events. But even if we take those out of the picture, what we do see are some areas where there are, particularly in the early years of life, some differences and that are coming up in the literature. So that's about learning IQ. Language is the most one, and then there's some evidence or something around about attention deficit. So there are two major papers that I want to draw your attention to. One published in the British Medical Journal in 2005 called The Cognitive Cost of Being a Twin, which found lower IQ of twins compared to their single-born siblings. And two papers that Michael Rutter in the UK and I wrote looking at language development in twins, in which we also looked at IQ, and we find a mild difference, and we only look at children born beyond 32 weeks, so we exclude those children who are born very preterm. And what we find is that there's a poorer performance of twins on verbal and non-verbal IQ and language, but it's a mild difference, so we do see that. Our conclusion from our data was, because we used extensive medical records alongside observation and tracking of these children for 3 years, is that what we find is once we exclude those children born very preterm or with extremes of obstetric anomaly, that it's social interactions that explain. But the Ronalds paper made the opposite conclusion, that it was obstetrics. Now, there's a reason for that. They're different cohorts. We were analysing a cohort of 17,000 families. This is the 1990s cohort, where we're comparing twins and singletons. We had small samples, but intensive study of them. Ronalds was looking at a 1950s Aberdeen cohort. And there's differences in what we were doing, so he didn't exclude anyone. So he's picking up, again, the differences between children, that subset of children who have some obstetric problems. So they're both right, but they're picking up on different things. So just going to the work that we did, what we found in that cohort of twins from the Avon longitudinal study, we tracked the children across the period when language development, so from a year through to 3 years. And what we did was testing of these children. We observed them in their homes. We observed them interacting with their siblings, with their parents. Very detailed video analysis to look at this and testing of the children. So we find at 20 months and again at 36 months that the twins are lagging behind their single-born counterparts in terms of language. And what we find also, confirming what was previously reported, that twins and monozygotic, male and monozygotic twins were those who had the highest risk for language delay. And that it was mild, but when we followed these kids up into their school years, it resolves, so that difference disappears. Attention deficit. There's a couple of papers, one coming out of Australia that was reported in 1996, suggesting high rates of ADHD in twins, but this was a small effect, and there's been only one other major report that I can find, but again, there's not sufficient control for obstetric factors, so it is likely that what the twin single-digit difference is attributed to that group who are at high obstetric risk. So again, all pointers to those early, the antenatal and the first postnatal year as being critical. As we know, it is critical in brain development, and so we might have overt disability, but we might also have subtle neurological effects. So some of what we're seeing here is likely the result of preterm birth or small for gestational age, rather than just the fact of being a twin. So in summary, in terms of what we see in development, there are mildly raised risks for developmental problems among twins once you exclude those who are born preterm or small for gestational age. And that if any study doesn't control for those, the developmental differences you see between single-born and multiple birth children is about all of that the antenatal year and the early perinatal environment. So it's about being small for gestational age and preterm. Once those the high-risk group are removed from the sample, what we still see are mild delays, but they're attributable to the differences in the early social environment, the care burden on parents, and those disruptions. And what's important in both cases is that we've got these two groups. It means there's something we can do to prevent or remedy the problems. So one is about the sorts of things Mark's team does, which is about dealing with those more difficult obstetric problems. But when we get to the mild delays, there's something we can do about those because they're about the social environment. So the first social environment, of course, is the parent. And myth or reality, is being a parent of twins more stressful? Well, there are two major studies that have been done. My very first paper that I did in the area of twins research was an analysis of the 1970s birth cohort in the United Kingdom of 17,000 families that included, and it was a cohort, so all we compared twins, close-spaced single-born children, and then widely spaced single-born children to look at whether there were differences. And what we were hypothesising was care burden, the amount of demand on parents made a difference to mothers' mental health. So that's why we didn't just do twin singleton, we were also interested to look at whether parents were dealing with care burdens of two very close children. What did that look like? What you can see in this graph is a nice sort of linear trend where if you've got an only child, you've got the lowest risk of depression, and if you've got twins, you've got the highest risk of depression. And this was a measure at when the children were 5 years of age. So there's clearly an evidence of care burden. The higher the care burden, the more demand, the more likely there is to be depression. Well, that's a good story, because if there's care burden, there's very good interventions to reduce care burden in terms of social supports. So that study was based on children at 5 years, and a more recent study published in 2009 looked at maternal depression at 9 months, so that's in the postnatal year. And mothers of multiple birth children had 43% more likelihood of having moderate or severe depression compared with mothers of singletons. And there were a range of predictors in there, as there was with the, if we go back to this one, the highest rates of depression were amongst those families who had a child with disability. And in this study, the highest rates of depression were amongst those who had children who were born very preterm. So they're dealing with a whole range of additional issues than just care, the normal care burden of looking after a young child. So that would account for a lot of that, but there's still a care burden in that first year that's very high. When we did research in the UK on the Avon study and we followed up kids, in fact it wasn't in the first months because there was a lot of support, but support seemed to drop off in the second half of the year of having a multiple birth child. And it dropped off at the time the kids became more mobile, and actually we saw in the second half of the postnatal year where support dropped and children became more demanding, that became, that depression actually went up. So the story here is the interventions need to be about providing additional supports, and the alert should be monitoring that over the first year of life. So the answer is yes, there is a higher care burden, particularly with those group that where there's been obstetric and perinatal complications, but for all parents there is an additional care burden. So what about twin relationships? Are they problematic? Well, I started by saying that I have a strengths-based approach to this, and I think when you're a researcher, you don't get funded for saying, oh, this is a good thing, you get funded for saying there's a problem. So we are directed to look at problems, but when you do the research, you certainly see strengths as well as challenges in multiple birth families. So strengths, there's closeness, there's a relationship, and the twin relationships offer opportunities. But if closeness becomes very close, it could be excluding and it could be a disadvantage. So what do we see there? A lot of you who might refer to the Twins and Multiple Birth website may have seen this typology of twins, that some might be extreme individuals, some closely coupled, and the hypothesized best place is to be balanced between your twin and multiple birth identity. So we took that hypothesis on, and we had a look at do those types exist, and what is the prevalence of them? So we did a study of twin children in an Australian sample with David Hayes. So we had 2 sites in Perth, David Hayes' site, and in Brisbane. We not only asked parents and teachers about the relationship between the twins, but we spent an extensive amount of time observing co-twins in their preschool classrooms in their first school year. What we find is that we saw no examples of, we had no reported examples of extreme individuals, very few close coupled, about 2% of our sample. Some were mixed, you know, between close coupled and mature. And what we found as we tracked over time was that number who were close coupled went down to 1%, and everyone had this nice balanced relationship. The 1%, however, who, when we followed them up when they were in year 3 at school, who were close coupled. What we found was, and I've taken the slide out because it was too complicated, was every single one of those children, one or both of the multiple birth children, had a clinically significant problem around, and the highest behavioural difficulty, and the most prevalent was attention deficit. We also observed these kids in their, and this is the slide from their preschool year, to see if we, independent of report, could see it. For many, we didn't observe them together at any time. 20% spent most of their time separately, though they were in the same classroom. Some, you know, we had engagement and separated. Interestingly, we only had 2% of our children in this sample who exclusively engaged together. And a couple of those were, and those children all had marked developmental disorders. So when we look more generally at the population, we find that conflict between twins, just the same as singletons. This is no different from singletons. Conflict, but not closeness in the twin relationship, predicted problems, and that there were no differences in behavioural problems in prevalence rates between twins and single-born children. And how do their relationships compare with siblings? Well, the thing that's different is they're together more, right? When I'm looking at them, they're in their early years, so they're birth through to about 5 to 8 years old. So we do see more conflict, but not high levels of conflict, because there's more opportunity for it. And it's only when you get unusual levels of conflict that you have problems, and that's the same as for single-borns. So that's the relationship between the children. What about the relationship between twin children and other children? One of the concerns that's very often raised is whether twin children, because they've got this nice relationship together, may have problems in making friendships elsewhere. Well, we've looked at this extensively, and we find that prior to school, twins have slightly less friends than single-born children. So as they enter school or childcare, they may have slightly less. And there are a range of things that might explain that. Firstly, it's hard to get a childcare place for 2 children at a time, so they may enter later. And the other is, you know, they may, when they're very young, want to stay together. But once they enter the world of childcare, a group-based setting, childcare or school, that difference in number of friends disappears. But what we know is that these children are more likely to share their friends, and the more similar you are, the more genetically similar you are, the more friends you will share. So monozygotic twins will share far more of their friends than dizygotics, and same-sex twins will share far more of their friends than opposite sex. And that's about two things: genetics. So when we choose friends, or when friends choose us, they choose people who are similar to them. And so it's not surprising that monozygotic children will have more of the same friends because they're very typically in the same social environment. And for same-sex pairs, it will also be a combination of their genetics, but also girls in the period that we are, it's same-sex friendships are more common, and therefore it's about contact. So they share friends, but is that a problem? So what we did was ask the children themselves, and some of these pictures that we use, we get them to draw and tell us about their friendships and so on. And what we find is that monozygotics, you know, here we have whether they enjoy, accept or dislike having the same, having to share friends, or sharing friends, choosing to share friends. And what we find is that monozygotic, dizygotic, same-sex and opposite, many of them talk about enjoying shared friendships and seeing, and that's the most likely, as you can see, that they will say. But some just talk about, well, it's my life. They don't question it. When we talk to them about it, they hadn't really thought about it, but they say, oh, well, yes, okay, they hadn't really thought about it. And a subset will talk about absolutely not liking it. And to give you some examples here, so I've just put, we do have, of course, opposite sex, but I just decided to put two in. So here we have the researcher saying, how do you feel about sharing your friends with your sister? Well, it's easy. It's not that bad, because it means, well, we agree on people to invite round and things. So there's a convenience thing for parents in there too. How do you feel about sharing your friends with Lucy? Nicola says, I don't really mind. I think it makes us have more friends each, which is really better because we're each other's friends as well as our own. Very nice. And then the third one, well, and Lachlan says, it's like if they are candy. It's like they're candy and I have to give most of them to my brother. I usually spend all the hard work getting friends and Nicholas steals them off me. So Nicholas was less happy about being a monozygotic who had to share his friends. And what we find with the dizygotic same-sex, remember they're genetically less similar, but they are placed together a lot. So here is a place where you might get more conflict, and you do. And so what we see in what they tell us is they like sharing friends, but only on certain conditions. And that came across again and again. So I've just chosen a couple. How do you feel about sharing your friends with Jane? And Tammy says, I quite like it actually, because like with Jane, it's lots of fun. Without Jane, I don't have as many laughs. So that's a nice one. But how do you feel about sharing your friends with Antonia? And Shannon says, when they come around to play, Antonia always wants to play with them as well. And the researcher says, well, is that all right? And she says, sometimes it's all right, and other times it isn't. So we got far more of those nuanced things. So they'd say, well, I don't mind when she brings this person, but not that person, or if she takes this friend or not that friend. So the big ticket question then is, what about going to school? Because when you're a parent of twins, the relationship between the twins, it's not being a twin that makes the decision about whether you should separate or bring children together. It's about who those children are, those individual children, and what are their developmental strengths and problems, and what's their relationship like, because that's important too. So we have done large-scale studies asking parents about their choices and why they chose to make the decisions they did. And we've classified those by those who chose to keep the children in the same class and those who separated. The overwhelming difference is that people, this is at entry to school, will only separate when there is a problem. So when there's a risk, when there's evidence of a risk. Not evidence for twins, but evidence for their twins. So we've never had this situation in Australia, but in America, in certain states, they had policy level decisions. So all twins would be separated, for example. And there have been legal challenges to that on the basis of individual rights. In Australia, we haven't had this. This is an Australian sample. So not surprisingly, regardless of whether you whether you place your children in the same class or if they're separated, the parents talk about it as an advantage. And whether you, but what you see is when there's evidence of risk, for example, I put examples here of what the parents say, or when there's evidence of risk, you're far more likely to separate, though you can have risk that means you keep them together. So we have parents saying separation, just as they're starting school, they're already in a new situation, and separation would be the stress. So that's a risk, but it's a risk that meant they kept them together. But poor behaviour together, or one is disabled, has a disability and the other one doesn't, or those are the sorts of things that caused parents to make a decision. What was interesting is parents very actively knew about, you know, the issues of individuality or keeping them together. So they also voiced absence of risk. You know, so they say, why would I separate them? We don't have a problem. They're fine together. Neither dominates. There's not a problem, and it's supportive to be together when you're going through a transition. But there was also absence of risk just in a handful who were separated, and that's because the kids themselves decided that they'd quite like to try being in a different class. An important thing to say about this is one of the things that we learned a lot about with parents was it's not as you enter school that it's a make or break. Many parents had a transition strategy. So when they went to school, they kept them together unless there was evidence of a problem. But they had a strategy that over time, once they got through the transition to school, that they were discussing it with their children and they might make decisions to separate at another point. Sometimes parents think it's a make or break, I have to make this decision now. And we had parents talk to us about having separated and not working and having to bring children back together as well. So it's a process, and it's a process of discussion with the educators who see them in a different. When we talk to teachers, I know I'm getting near the end, when we talk to teachers, teachers did not see many difficulties. And when they talked about difficulties, it mostly wasn't about being a twin, it was about general developmental difficulties. So teachers' views were basically that, you know, twin children, there was a lot about being together as a strength in the transition to school. And only 23% of teachers described any difficulties in the twin children's behaviour. So 3/4 of the children, there was nothing that they had to say in terms of any problem. So just in summary, and this is my last slide, I think, in terms of placement decisions, you know, what parents tell us is that it's not a one-off, it's a process, and that if there's not a risk, keeping them together at first and then working over to get through the stress of transition and then working together works well. But for some families where there are quite big disparities or problems, that is a different situation. It's not, you don't either just separate or keep twins together. You have to look at the individual children. It's very personal, and also discuss it with the children, because 5-year-olds are really good. All of this data, and you know, we've got a lot of data from them. The reasons that you might keep children together or not to consider are social support, anxiety, thinking about a transition as a process, and the absence of something, not necessarily just the presence of a problem. So what I always say when asked about this is when you're a parent of multiple birth children, you have to consider whether there are problems, but don't assume, because in the large majority, and those particularly children who've not had adversity in their pregnancy or in the first postnatal year, they're doing pretty well. So my final thing is there's lots of challenges that have to be monitored, but incredible strengths and advantages of being a multiple birth child. So most twins have normal development. They're different because they have a child alongside them, and that's it. Thanks.